Imagine this. A single footprint pressed into ancient ash uncovered at dawn as the wind peels back a quiet layer the world never meant to show you. To night traveller, you are not here by accident. Some patient gravity of fate has drawn you to a question that refuses to stay buried. What if human history is not a ladder, but a cycle repeating like seasons in the dark? In the ice and the deep seabed, scientists read abrupt shifts that can reshape coastlines in mere centuries. And on land, monuments appear with a precision that feels borrowed from an older mind, a buried structure aligned to Orion, still pointing skyward as if waiting. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. A small lamp glows at the edge of midnight, and within that warm circle of light a map lies open like a quiet confession. Dust gathers along the fold lines where rivers were once traced in blue. Pencil marks soften at the margins as if time has been erasing the hand that drew them. Outside the window the world is ordinary traffic, far away a stray dog bark the faint sigh of wind. But here on this desk the planet feels older. It feels like something that has been keeping secrets for longer than language has existed to name them. To night traveller, you arrive at this moment the way an object drifts into a gravitational field, slowly, inevitably drawn by a force you can't quite see. You may think you chose this story, but sometimes a story chooses you. Sometimes the universe guides a curious mind to the edge of a question precisely when it can be held gently without panic, without noise. There is a kind of attention that only comes when the day finally loosens its grip, when the mind is tired enough to stop performing certainty. In that softened state, the world's unanswered things can approach without startling us. I've spent long nights with instruments that hum quietly in the dark seismographs, writing thin, trembling lines like distant heartbeats. Satellites folding the surface of Earth into grids of data sonar maps, weaving the seafloor into patterns that look like cloth. In those hours, it becomes clear that our planet does not speak in a straight line. It speaks in rhythm. Gravity is memory. It holds what came before and presses it forward, layer by layer into the present. Erosion is time thinking, slowly sanding down the sharp edges of events until only the most stubborn outlines remain. And the deeper you look, the more those outlines suggest that history is not a single ascent, but a repeating wave. What are the odds, observer, that a world as restless as Earth would grant humanity only one clean beginning? We like the idea of a simple timeline because it helps us sleep. A beginning placed conveniently close to us. A ladder of progress. 12,000 years and counting. The first cities, the first writing, the first laws, neat milestones in a hallway with tidy doors. But the planet keeps another kind of record, one that doesn't care about comfort. It keeps timestamps in ice, in fossil pollen, in the chemistry of ancient oceans. It keeps scars in stone, and sometimes the record does not behave politely. Sometimes it snaps. Temperatures shift faster than expected. Sea levels jump by meters in what amounts to a geological blink. Ash settles across continents like a thin black veil. A stable world becomes unstable, and what lived there, what was built there, must either adapt quickly or vanish. Flood alone cannot do it. Ice alone cannot do it. Fire alone cannot do it. Darkness alone cannot do it. But a sequence can, a cascade, a reset that arrives in stages as if the planet turns a page and the ink is still wet. If civilizations rise during long periods of stability, then the most vulnerable thing they build is not stone or metal. It is continuity, memory, the fragile thread that connects one generation's knowledge to the next. When that thread snaps, a city can drown and leave only silt. A coast can be swallowed and leave only a shelf of drowned land. A culture can fracture into survivors scattered through forests, mountains, and caves. People carrying fragments of skills they no longer fully understand, like broken tools, passed down without instructions. Over time, the descendants of those survivors might rebuild, believing they are the beginning when in truth they are only the aftermath. And that is how a new civilization can feel ancient and young, at the same time young in confidence, ancient in the shadows it inherits. This is where myth becomes interesting not as proof, but as a kind of echo. Radiation is a whisper in the cosmic background, ancient light still travelling, still arriving. In the same way, stories can carry faint signals across millennia. Flood myths, skyfire myths, long winter myths, wandering survivors, teachers from the sky or the sea who arrive with knowledge that seems too advanced for the age. These stories may be symbolic or they may be trauma memories. Humanity's way of packaging catastrophe into language that can survive the fall. When similar patterns appear across cultures separated by oceans and time, it does not mean they all share a literal event in detail. But it does suggest something. Shared was being remembered that the world can change suddenly, and that people can survive it, and that survival itself leaves a mark. Then come the anomalies, the sharp stones in the smooth narrative, the things that refuse to cooperate with the official timeline, a structure that seems too precisely aligned with the sky, a pattern on the seafloor that looks too geometric to be accidental, a report of an object found in a place where objects should not exist. Sometimes these claims are wrong, sometimes they are hoaxes, sometimes they are misunderstandings, our minds reaching for wonder because wonder feels like oxygen. But what unsettles the careful researcher is not any single claim. It is repetition, the same kind of story returning from different corners of the world, the same tension between what the ground suggests and what the textbook insists. And then there is the quietest pattern of all silence, a paper published and then withdrawn, a museum object placed in a drawer without a catalogue number, a lab sample declared lost, a site suddenly restricted behind fences and permits. This does not automatically mean a hidden hand is controlling the narrative. More often it means something simpler and more human. Institutions resist revision. Careers are built on accepted timelines. Funding follows familiar stories. It's easier to label an anomaly as contamination than to reopen the foundations of a field. Sometimes suppression is not a villain. Sometimes it's a reflex, a way of protecting stability, a way of keeping the public from staring too long into the possibility that our world is not a peak but a moment. Because if earlier civilizations rose and fell, if the planet has done this before, then the most unsettling implication is not about the past, it is about the future. It is the realization that our own systems, so bright and interconnected, may also be fragile. Our memory is now stored in satellites, servers, and electricity ghosts that cannot swim, cannot breathe. Ash cannot endure ice. We have built a civilization made of light, and light is beautiful, but it flickers. Somewhere beyond our reach, something ancient still moves, not with malice, but with the indifferent patience of cycles. Still, traveller, you do not need to fear this thought. Not tonight. Tonight we are simply observing. We are letting the question exist without forcing it into an answer. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Silence is the universe thinking, and in that silence a deeper calm can form the calm that comes from honesty. We may not know how many times humanity has risen. We may not know what truly ended those forgotten ages. But we can admit the record is complex, the planet is old, and certainty is often younger than it pretends to be. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. A thin blade of dawn slides across a desert plateau, and for a moment the shadows of stone look like the ribs of something vast beneath the sand. From far away the ruins are quiet shapes, rectangles, terraces, broken steps, nothing dramatic, nothing loud. But as the light climbs, the geometry becomes harder to ignore. Straight lines where you expected randomness. Angles that hold steady as if they were intended to last. It feels less like stumbling onto rubble, and more like walking into a sentence the Earth has been trying to finish for a very long time. This is the part of the journey where evidence does not arrive as a single undeniable revelation. It arrives the way gravity arrives, patiently and visibly gathering small things into a larger pool. A measurement here, a map there, a pattern that repeats when it should not. And slowly, traveller, your mind begins to notice what it once skimmed past, not because you are chasing fantasy, but because you are practicing a more ancient skill, the ability to sit with anomalies without immediately crushing them into an explanation. We often imagine ancient people as trapped beneath a primitive sky staring up with wonder, but lacking the tools to truly understand what they saw. Yet again and again we find calendars and alignments that behave like careful mathematics. Structures oriented with startling precision toward cardinal directions. Passageways that frame solstice light like a deliberate instrument. Stones arranged to track lunar cycles or to mark the return of certain stars. A skeptic can say, and often rightly, that human beings are brilliant pattern makers capable of surprising precision with simple tools and deep observation. But even that skeptical truth contains a quieter mystery. Observation itself requires time continuity, a stable tradition of watching. You do not casually encode the sky into stone unless the sky has been studied as if it matters. And what if it mattered, for reasons we no longer remember? When I sit with old survey notes and modern satellite imagery, the feeling is always the same. The planet looks less like a museum of isolated wonders, and more like a palimpsest layers of writing scraped away and written over again and again. Rivers change course, coasts retreat, forests become deserts, ice sheets advance, and then melt back like slow breathing. Sea levels rise and fall by dozens of meters across the long arc of climate cycles, drowning entire plains that were once walkable, livable, cultivable. The ground is not a permanent stage. It is a moving curtain, and that single fact, simple, scientific, undeniable, changes what evidence even means. Because if coastlines were lower during glacial periods, then the places where early people may have lived most densely are now underwater. Continental shelves that look empty from the surface were once broad landscapes with rivers, valleys, and long shorelines. In that frame, the absence of ruins on land stops being proof of absence. It becomes a reminder of where we have not looked and how much the ocean has quietly kept. So the evidence begins to turn in your hands like a strange artifact revealing new faces depending on how you hold it. In one light, it is archaeology stonework that seems unusually precise foundations that appear older than the cultures who later built upon them sudden leaps in architectural sophistication that do not always show a neat trail of prototypes. In another light, it is geology ice cores with abrupt transitions, sediment layers that record sudden flooding ash horizons that hint at volcanic winters. In another, it is biology population, bottlenecks, migrations, the strange resilience of small groups surviving when conditions turn harsh. None of these fields alone says there were 6 forgotten civilizations, but together they suggest a world capable of repeating upheaval, capable of breaking continuity so thoroughly that a later age might mistake itself for the first. This is where the metaphor becomes almost literal. Erosion is time thinking. It does not destroy everything, it edits. It removes detail first, then context, then names. It leaves behind what is heaviest, what is deepest, what is stubborn. That is why when people imagine lost civilizations, they often picture glittering cities still standing waiting to be found. But real loss is quieter. Real loss is scattered fragments, stones, out-of-place patterns. Half erased a terrace that doesn't match the hillside, a drowned platform on a sonar scan that looks too straight, too regular, too intentional to be comforting. And sometimes evidence is not what we find, but how we respond when we find it. There are nights, quiet, ordinary nights when I think about how knowledge travels. We assume it moves like a torch passed forward, flame to flame, never truly going out. But history suggests another possibility: knowledge also moves like embers. It can be buried, it can dim, it can survive without being understood. A technique might persist as ritual long after its purpose is forgotten. A story might survive as myth long after its origin is gone. A structure might be imitated by later builders who feel its power but cannot reproduce its method. In that sense, civilization is not only invention, it is also inheritance. And inheritance can be fragmented, especially after catastrophe. So when you hear ancient flood stories across continents, it is not necessary to claim they are identical eyewitness reports. It is enough to notice that human beings have repeatedly remembered a world that changed suddenly, darkness that lasted too long, water that rose too fast, fire that fell from the sky, survivors who fled to high ground and carried something tall seed songs into a future that felt like a reset. Even if each story grew in symbolism over time, their persistence is itself a kind of evidence, an emotional fossil preserved because it mattered. To night observer, imagine the Earth as an archive written in multiple languages at once. In rock it speaks chemistry, in ice it speaks trapped air, in ocean sediments it speaks slow accumulation punctuated by sudden disruptions, in ruins it speaks geometry, in myths it speaks memory. And in all of them there is a repeating theme: stability is temporary, and the planet has reset its surface more than once. That doesn't mean we must conclude we are the seventh civilization. It means we must admit the question is not absurd. It is a question the planet itself invites because the planet is older than our confidence. And when you allow that thought to rest in your mind gently, without forcing it, another feeling arrives behind it. Not fear, but humility. The soft understanding that our story may be nested inside other stories, older stories, stories that ended so completely that only faint outlines remain. Some mysteries wait, others watch. And tonight the universe whispers again, not in certainty, but in possibility, the way starlight travels for years, just to touch your eyes for a moment. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. A single lamp glows over a cluttered desk, and the rest of the room is swallowed by gentle darkness. Dust rests on old atlases like fallen snow. A ruler lies across a map as if it has been left there mid-measurement, mid-thought. Outside the window the night sky is quiet, no drama, no announcement, just the steady presence of distant light. This is where anomalies feel most alive, traveller. Not in a museum hall or a headline, but in the soft stillness where the mind has space to notice what doesn't fit. An anomaly is a small rebellion against a story that has become too smooth. It is a scratch on polished glass, a number that refuses to line up. A tool found in a place that asks an uncomfortable question. Science does not fear anomalies. Science begins with them. And yet there is a particular kind of anomaly that unsettles us because it doesn't simply challenge a detail. It challenges the timeline itself, the comforting sense that the past is a simple staircase leading up to us. This is why certain discoveries, real or rumoured, have such power over the imagination. A metal object reported from a seam of ancient coal. A stone formation underwater that looks at first glance like architecture. A hammer-like shape said to be sealed in limestone. A strange machined surface that seems too regular, too deliberate to be the result of random geology. Some of these claims collapse under scrutiny. Some are hoaxes. Some are misinterpretations. And some remain in that unsettling middle space where the evidence is incomplete, the documentation thin, and the questions louder than the answers. But even when a specific story turns out to be wrong, the larger tension stays. Because the Earth is capable of preserving and hiding things in ways our intuition does not easily grasp. Sediment can bury a coastline in a few thousand years. Mineral deposits can seal an object inside a hard shell. Volcanic ash can blanket a landscape so completely that a whole chapter becomes a silent layer. And time is not a gentle librarian. Time is a storm that rearranges shelves, shreds, labels, and leaves behind only the books that were heavy enough to survive. So the careful mind does two things at once. It doubts, and it listens. When I say listen, I don't mean accepting every strange claim as proof of a lost world. I mean listening to the pattern behind the claims, the recurring human encounter, with things that don't behave the way the official story expects. In one era, the anomaly might be a stone block cut with precision that seems disproportionate to the tools we assume were available. In another, it might be a sudden appearance of complex planning. Drainage systems, grid-like city layouts, standardized measurements emerging faster than our linear models predict. In another, it might be a myth that refuses to die, echoing across cultures that never met. Different forms, same pressure. The past is not as neat as we want it to be. This is where the metaphor becomes useful. Think of gravity as memory. Massive things, mountains, oceans, ice sheets pull history around them. They shape migration routes, preserve coastlines, erase settlements, reveal new land, swallow old land. Human stories orbit these forces, and when the forces shift, when sea levels rise, when climate swings, when volcanic winters arrive, memory can be broken. Not because people forget, but because continuity is physically interrupted. A culture can dissolve when its land becomes ocean. A language can vanish when its speakers scatter. A library can burn, and with it the scaffolding of a knowledge collapses into ash. If earlier civilizations existed advanced or simply complex, their greatest vulnerability would not be a lack of intelligence, it would be fragility. Civilization is a delicate arrangement of networks, agriculture, trade, shared meaning, specialized skill. It takes time to build, and it can unravel quickly. You can have brilliant minds and still lose everything if the conditions that support cooperation break. And when that happens, what survives is rarely the highest technology. What survives is what is portable, what is durable, what is remembered without writing, a method of counting, a way to track stars, a story of the flood, a warning disguised as a prayer. So the anomaly is not necessarily a machine sealed in stone. The anomaly might be the way knowledge seems to reappear, skills emerging fully, formed not out of nowhere but out of a dark gap. A civilization rising faster than expected, as if it inherited fragments it could not fully explain. We see this in small ways even in modern life, how children absorb language without understanding grammar, how a craft can be passed down through hands, how a pattern can persist even when its origin is lost. Multiply that across millennia, across collapses, and the past begins to feel less like a straight line and more like waves returning to a shore. And then there is the silence. The silence is not always conspiracy. Sometimes it is simply the normal gravity of institutions. Careers built on certain assumptions, museums that cannot display everything, academic caution that prefers what can be verified. And sometimes silence is just the ocean doing what it has always done, keeping secrets by being vast. If most ancient coastlines are underwater, then most ancient coastlines are simply beyond easy reach. No need for hidden hands, only depth pressure darkness. Still, it's hard not to notice how some anomalies ignite intense reactions. A brief report appears, then disappears. A discovery is announced, then reframed. A site becomes restricted for reasons that may be mundane protection. Safety politics, ownership, but which nonetheless have the same effect, the evidence becomes harder to touch. And when evidence becomes harder to touch, the imagination rushes in to fill the gap. That is human nature too. We don't only fear darkness, we also build stories inside it. So tonight, listener, let's hold a balanced lantern. On one side, skepticism, clean, steady, necessary. On the other, wonder, quiet, patient, honest. With both lights together, you can walk without falling into gullibility, and without sealing every door before you've even looked inside. Because the deeper truth beneath these anomalies is not a single claim. It is the possibility that the planet is older, wilder, and more cyclic than the tidy version we tell ourselves before sleep. That civilization may not be the first delicate structure built atop stable ground. That the Earth can erase chapters so thoroughly that later ages mistake the remaining fragments for isolated miracles. And if that is true, even partly true, then the most haunting idea is also the gentlest, that we are not separate from the past. We are made of it. Our curiosity is a kind of inheritance. Our questions are echoes travelling through time like radiation, whispering from distant events still detectable, if you know how to listen. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Tonight the universe whispers again. A thin layer of mist drifts over the sea at dawn, and the surface looks like glass pretending to be empty. If you stare long enough, you start to feel it, traveller, the strange idea that water is not only water. It is a curtain. It is a memory. It is time holding its breath. Somewhere beneath that quiet skin, the world keeps shapes it does not show easily. Old shorelines, drowned valleys, terraces that might be natural, or might be something else entirely. From above, everything appears calm. From below, the past can still be arranged like a city that never learned it was supposed to disappear. This is where the story of the seventh civilization becomes less about dramatic claims and more about the geometry of loss. During the last great swings of climate, sea levels rose and fell by enough to redraw entire continents. Coastlines moved like slow tides across thousands of years, swallowing plains, covering river mouths, burying harbours that once faced open sky. If a culture had flourished on those edges near fresh water, near trade routes, near the mild climates of continental shelves, its ruins would now lie under hundreds of feet of ocean pressed into silence. Not because anyone hid them, but because the planet is very good at hiding its own footprints. And when we do reach down with sonar, with submersibles, with divers tracing lines in the dark, we sometimes find forms that make the mind hesitate. Straight edges where we expect broken ones, repeated angles where we expect randomness, steps that look like steps, platforms that look like platforms. None of this is proof by itself. Nature can imitate architecture, and our pattern, hungry brains can turn geology into a city overnight. But the tension remains because the ocean does not just conceal, it also preserves. There are places where cold water slows decay, where sediment tucks surfaces away like blankets, where an entire landscape can be sealed from air and sunlight for ages. Still, the most haunting part is not what we might find beneath the waves. It is what happens to a species when its world is rewritten faster than its stories can keep up. If a coastline vanishes in a lifetime, the survivors don't carry marble columns or machine parts into the mountains. They carry what fits inside breath and bone roots, warnings, fragments of sky knowledge, rituals that encode practical truths. A calendar becomes a prayer, a navigation method becomes a myth, a record of catastrophe becomes a legend about gods and floods, because the language of disaster is the only language that can survive disaster. This is why the idea of cycles feels so persuasive in the quiet hours, not because it is sensational, but because it matches what we already know about fragility. Civilization is a network of dependencies, and networks can fail suddenly. Once the chain breaks, food systems, trade, shared trust, stable seasons, the most complex tools become useless ornaments. The survivors do not rebuild a world by remembering everything. They rebuild by remembering just enough, and that just enough can look generations later like a miracle, a sudden leap in planning, a sudden return of geometry, a sudden reappearance of alignments to stars that were watched long before the current age knew how to look. So, when we speak of a seventh civilization, we are not only speaking of buried stone and drowned grids. We are speaking of a recurring human condition rising into complexity, then losing the thread, then rising again with gaps stitched over by certainty. The Earth does not need to erase us with malice, it only needs to change, and change is what it does in long rhythms that feel invisible until they arrive. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Sleep, traveller, the cosmos will keep watch. A desert wind moves across an empty basin, and for a moment the sand lifts like breath, revealing a faint pattern lines that should not be there, angles that feel too deliberate as if the ground once remembered streets. Then the gust passes, and the surface becomes smooth again, innocent again. That is how forgotten epochs behave, traveller. They do not vanish with a sound. They fade by being covered, rewritten, relabeled by seasons that do not care what humans hoped would last. And yet the Earth keeps records the way a deep library keeps records layered in perfect patient waiting for the right light. When I think about a forgotten civilization, I do not imagine a shining empire frozen in time. I imagine something quieter and more realistic communities that grew during a rare window of stability, when rainfall patterns were kind, when coasts were predictable, when rivers held their course. In those windows, humans do what humans always do. They settle, they plan, they standardize, they build with the confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. But the planet has never promised us that. The planet tilts and wobbles, it shuffles its oceans, it changes the rules slowly until suddenly it doesn't feel slow anymore. There are clues that do not require fantasies. Lake beds in places that are now bone dry. Fossil pollen that speaks of grasslands where only dunes remain. Ancient shorelines etched into rock far above the current sea like old scars. And when science reads these signs, it reads a world that has transformed repeatedly deserts that were once green coastlines, that marched inland ice that advanced like a silent continent then retreated. Erosion is time thinking, grinding down what is exposed, saving what is buried. And burial is not just hiding. Burial is preservation, sometimes the only kind that lasts. This is why the deepest evidence of earlier ages is rarely dramatic. It is not a single object that proves everything, but a pattern that refuses to stay quiet. A cluster of anomalies that keep appearing in different places in different sediments under different climates, like scattered pages of the same lost chapter. A strange alignment that makes sense only if the sky was watched longer than we assume. A foundation that seems older than the story built on top of it. A coastline that once supported life now sleeping underwater. None of these are final answers, but together they produce a tension in the mind, a soft pressure like gravity, pulling you toward a question you didn't plan to ask. And here is the unsettling comfort cycles explain both presence and absence. If a civilization is erased by a long drought, its cities don't burn in a single night. They are abandoned, dismantled, scavenged, swallowed by dust. If it is erased by flood, it becomes a rumour beneath silt. If it is erased by volcanic winter, it becomes a migration and a memory. If it is erased by ice, it becomes geology. The evidence is not gone, it is displaced, pushed into places we do not often look, or preserved in forms we do not usually treat as history. The ocean floor, the deep desert, the buried valley, the cold archive of ice. Sometimes late at night, when instruments hum softly and the room is dim, I think of how thin our own era is. We are proud of our records, our satellites, our databases, our endless pages of digital certainty, yet even our knowledge is fragile. A long blackout, a network collapse, a shift in supply and stability. Our world too is a delicate arrangement, and that is what makes the thought of earlier rises feel less impossible. Not because ancient people were magical, but because civilization itself is a process that can happen more than once. If conditions allow it, humans will build. If conditions break, humans will scatter. And what survives is not the whole world, but fragments, tools without context, monuments without names, myths without dates. Myth in this sense is not the enemy of science. It is the shadow of experience preserved in human language when stone and paper fail. Radiation is a whisper in the background of the universe, and myth is a whisper in the background of our species. It says something happened, something changed, something ended. The details drift, the characters transform into gods or monsters, but the emotional core remains the memory of a world being overturned. And when similar stories appear in places that never shared a map, it becomes harder to dismiss the shared shape as pure coincidence. Not proof traveller, but signal. So the forgotten epoch is not a single golden age buried neatly under our feet. It is a series of windows opening and closing across time, each leaving residues, each taking most of its complexity with it when it goes. If we are the seventh civilization, then we are not a final achievement. We are a current configuration, one wave, cresting one moment of light between long shadows. And the earth beneath us is not a stage, it is an archive. It keeps what it can in the only language that does not lie layers. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again. A quiet jungle canopy sways, and beneath it, the ground holds geometry-raised lines, old canal shapes too patient to be accidental. The leaves drink the moonlight and the air is warm and heavy, but the silence feels older than the trees. If you stood here at dawn, traveller, you might mistake the whole place for untouched wilderness. Yet in certain angles, when light slides sideways and shadows sharpen, the earth begins to confess. Not loudly, not with certainty, just with a faint suggestion that something once organized this living chaos, then stepped away and let the green return. A reset does not announce itself like a headline. It begins as imbalance, small shifts that most creatures adapt to without understanding. A rainy season that arrives late, a river that changes its mind, a coastline that creeps inland by the width of a human lifetime, then another, until the old paths become salt water. In the language of physics, it's energy moving toward a new arrangement. In the language of geology, it's pressure releasing, sediment settling, ice advancing and retreating. And in the language of human life, it is interruption, the slow breaking of continuity that turns knowledge into a rumour. We like to imagine collapse as spectacle, fire, darkness, a single night where everything ends. But the planet is more subtle than our dramas. It resets through sequences, wet years that become dry years, Warm decades that shift into cold, a chain of events that nudges a society toward fragility, then tips it. One flood does not erase a world, but it can strip away the margins that keep a world stable. One volcanic season does not erase a language, but it can scatter its speakers. One drought does not erase a city, but it can turn trade routes into empty lines on a map. And when disruptions overlap water ash coal darkness, the effect is not just destruction, it is disconnection. This is what makes the idea of repeating civilizations feel both unsettling and strangely reasonable. Human communities rise when conditions allow them to specialize. When food is reliable, people can become builders, navigators, astronomers, record keepers. Complexity grows the way a coastline grows by small additions that only look inevitable in hindsight. But complexity is also a kind of dependence. It depends on seasons staying recognizable on rivers, not vanishing on coastlines, not moving too fast on networks, not snapping. When the environment changes faster than a society can reconfigure the system, it doesn't just lose buildings, it loses the invisible threads that explain how to rebuild them. Sometimes I picture the reset as a silent wave moving through time, not a wave of water but a wave of constraint. Fewer harvests, less surplus, less time for precision. In that shrinking space, the old crafts become harder to maintain. The master builder teaches fewer students. The astronomer's careful calendar is replaced by rough memory. The engineer's tools wear out and cannot be replaced. A world can still exist, people can still survive, yet a civilization in the sense of sustained complexity quietly unravels. The stones remain, but the method becomes myth. The alignment remains, but the reason becomes ritual. The map remains, but the coast it describes is already underwater, and then on certain nights the mind wanders farther. Beyond climate shifts and sea level rise, beyond volcanoes and droughts, toward the larger sky that never stops moving. The Earth is not alone in space. It swims through a field of debris, through cycles of solar activity, through cosmic rhythms that are indifferent to our calendars. Impacts are rare, but rarity is not the same as impossibility. A single, large object entering the atmosphere carries energies that are difficult to hold in the imagination, an event that can heat the air, ignite forests, push dust and aerosols into the stratosphere, dimming sunlight for seasons. Not a guaranteed traveller. Just a reminder that the planet's history includes abrupt pages, not only slow chapters. In that sense, a reset is like radiation, invisible but real, unseen but shaping outcomes over long spans. It is also like gravity, a quiet force that makes patterns repeat. Civilizations settle where water is, where soil is fertile, where coastlines offer trade and food. And when the planet reshapes those zones, when water migrates, when soil dries, when coasts flood, the same kinds of centers are disrupted again and again. The repeating nature of human settlement is not proof of repeating empires. It is simply what happens when one species meets one changing planet and tries to build permanence on top of motion. This is why the most haunting possibility is not that earlier worlds were better than ours. It is that they were familiar. They may have had their own versions of confidence, their own belief that they lived at the peak of progress, their own assumption that tomorrow would follow the rules of yesterday. And then the rules changed, not because anyone wanted them to, but because Earth is a system, and systems drift. I think of this when I'm alone with old maps spread across a desk dust on my fingertips, a soft lamp making the paper look like parchment. I trace coastlines that no longer exist, river deltas that have migrated, ancient shorelines now stranded inland. The more you stare, the more you feel it. Time is not a straight road. It is a moving landscape. If you're a listening late observer, you might notice how easily the mind accepts cycles once it relaxes. Sleep itself is a small cycle, wake, drift, fall, return. Seasons mirror it. Oceans mirror it. Even the sky mirrors it with its repeating paths, its slow procession, its long rhythms that outlast names. The idea that civilization could be cyclical is not comforting, but it is not hopeless either. It simply places us inside nature rather than above it. It reminds us that history is not only written by people, it is written by sediment, by ice, by tides, by ash, by the planet's patient hand. And if a reset has happened before, then the evidence would not shout. It would flicker. The foundation too old for the building above it. a flooded shelf that once held villages, a pattern in myth that matches a pattern in stone, a strange leap in knowledge that looks less like invention and more like recovery. These are not final answers. They are the quiet edges where the official story grows thin and the deeper story begins to show through. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. A thin layer of sediment settles on the ocean floor like slow snowfall, and somewhere beneath it a straight edge waits in the dark. No one hears it. No one remembers the hands that placed it. Yet the water keeps moving above it, patient and rhythmic, as if the sea itself is practicing the same motion it has repeated for tens of thousands of years. If you could see through the miles of water and time traveller, you might find a terrace, a channel, a step cut too cleanly to feel accidental. Not a full city with lights and noise, but an echo architecture reduced to geometry, history reduced to a shape. Echoes are what remain when a world loses its voice. A civilization does not vanish in a single moment so much as it dissolves into smaller and smaller signals. First, the trade routes fail. Then the specialized crafts thin out. Then the stories shorten, turning from instruction into legend. Finally, even the legend becomes a mood, an inherited feeling that something once stood here, something older than the names we use. The planet is full of those moods. You can feel them in places where stone sits too confidently on a hillside, where a coastline suddenly makes no sense, where a ruin looks less like a beginning and more like a leftover. In science, we learn to respect faint signals, a whisper in a radio receiver, a spectral line that shouldn't be there, a tiny wobble in a star's light hinting at a hidden planet. The universe rarely hands us clean answers. It offers patterns, anomalies, probabilities. The past is the same. What survives a reset is not the full library. It is a few torn pages, sometimes soaked in myth, sometimes sealed in sediment. And when you place those pages side by side, the feeling changes. It becomes harder to call each fragment a coincidence. It becomes easier to imagine that history is not a single staircase but a shoreline built and rebuilt by waves. Think of memory the way gravity works. Gravity doesn't shout, it holds. It gathers dust into disks, disks into worlds, worlds into systems. Memory does something similar inside a species. Even when knowledge is lost, instincts remain. Humans return to rivers. Humans return to coasts. Humans return to the sky for calendars and direction. After a collapse, survivors don't invent from nothing. They improvise from what they can carry, a technique, a ratio, a story that sounds like nonsense until the right kind of mind hears it. Over generations, those carried fragments become seeds. And seeds, when conditions allow, become structures again. This is why the oldest monuments sometimes feel strangely complete. Not because the past was magical, but because the past may have inherited. A later culture might stand among ruins and treat them as sacred, imitating forms they do not fully understand. They might rebuild a temple on top of a foundation that predates their language. They might align stones to a star because the alignment feels right, because tradition insists, because the echo of an earlier science has become ritual. In that way, astronomy becomes prayer, engineering becomes myth, and precision becomes a kind of holy muscle memory. The ocean is especially good at preserving and hiding. It buries quickly, seals in low oxygen, shields from weather. It also moves shorelines like a slow eraser. During colder periods, sea levels fall, exposing vast shelves, plains and river valleys that could support large human populations. During warmer periods, those shelves drown, and what was once ordinary land becomes a deep boundary, a place divers cannot easily reach. This is not fantasy. It is physics and ice. Water expands and contracts with temperature, ice sheets grow, and melt, coastlines migrate. If you want to hide a chapter of human life, the ocean is the perfect archivist. It keeps the page, but it removes the table of contents. And then there are the stories, those stubborn, cross-cultural memories that behave like recurring dreams, floods, fires from the sky, long winters, darkness that lasts too long to be a simple storm. Modern minds often want to sort these into neat categories: metaphor, morality, entertainment. But stories can be another kind of sediment laid down in the mind when something is too large to explain directly. Trauma compresses narrative. Generations polish it. The details shift, but the core persists. The world changed suddenly, and the survivors walked away carrying only fragments. If you sit with that idea long enough, listener, you begin to understand why people reach for the word cycle. Not because it is proven in a single artifact, but because it feels compatible with how Earth behaves. The planet tilts, wobbles, warms, cools, winds shift, currents weaken, volcanoes pulse. The sky sends visitors rare but real, and when they arrive, the energy is not gentle. A reset in the broad sense is simply the planet reorganizing itself. Life adapts, but civilization with its delicate dependence on stability adapts more slowly. And so the great irony appears: the more complex a society becomes, the more fragile its continuity can be. Sometimes late at night I imagine a researcher decades from now reading our time the way we read the past, finding our ruins in sediment, interpreting our patterns from faint traces. They won't recover our full conversations or the warmth of our ordinary days. They'll find outlines of chemical signature in ice, a layer of microplastics, a sudden shift in carbon ratios, an abrupt scatter of debris. They will build stories from fragments just as we do, and perhaps they will feel the same tension we feel now, the desire to know and the acceptance that some knowledge arrives only as a shadow. So the question is not simply whether earlier civilizations existed. The deeper question is what we mean by evidence when time is the greatest eraser. Evidence is not always a statue with a name. Sometimes it's a repeating alignment, a drowned terrace, a myth that matches a coastline that once existed, a pattern of leaps in knowledge that look like resurfacing rather than invention. None of it forces a conclusion, but together it invites a different posture: humility. The kind that lets you say calmly that the past may be larger than our textbooks, and the planet may have turned pages we have not yet learned to read. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. A pale ribbon of starlight lies across the night sky like a quiet scar, and beneath it the earth turns with the same old patience as if nothing has ever changed. But if you watch long enough, observer, you begin to notice that the calm is only a surface condition. Underneath, patterns move, currents shift, ice advances and retreats. Coastlines inhale and exhale. Even the stars above us slide slowly through procession, as if the heavens themselves are writing the map while we sleep. This is how the world keeps time, not with dates, but with cycles that return subtle at first, then unmistakable. A pattern is not a prophecy. In science, a pattern is an invitation to measure. It asks us to gather more data, to test, to doubt our first impressions. Yet patterns also change the way we feel. They make coincidence harder to accept. They turn scattered anomalies into something like a conversation. And if you place the clues of lost ages side by side, flood memories, sudden architectural leaps, submerged grids, strange gaps in progress, something begins to form, faint but coherent, like a constellation you can't unsee once your eyes adjust. Civilization in this view is not a straight ascent. It is a wave travelling through a restless medium. It rises on stability, builds on predictable seasons, grows bold under clear skies. Then the medium shifts, the climate flips, the sea climbs, the ash falls, the sun dims behind veils of dust. A single generation can watch the rules of the planet change, and all the delicate systems that took centuries to knit together begin to unravel. What survives is rarely the tallest tower. What survives is whatever can fit inside a human life, a route remembered by heart, a ratio carved into stone, a story repeated until it becomes bone deep. This is why the idea of pattern feels so unsettling and yet so natural. Earth itself is patterned. Its climate rhythms are driven by the slow mathematics of orbits and tilts, by feedback loops of ice and ocean and air. Its geology is patterned by pressure fracture uplift erosion. Even the biosphere is patterned expansions and contractions, bottlenecks and blooms. If nature is rhythmic, it would be strange if human history were the only thing that behaved like a clean, uninterrupted line. But the most haunting patterns are not the ones written in graphs. They are the ones written in absence, the missing chapters, the places where an expected transition never appears. We search for prototypes of great stonework and find little. We expect a gradual ramp up to precise astronomy and find cultures that seem to look up and already know. We expect ancient shorelines to be empty, and instead sonar returns shapes that resemble planning. None of this proves a grand hidden timeline on its own, yet the cumulative effect is a pressure on the official story, a gentle but persistent forcing function, like water finding the smallest crack in stone. And then there is the human response to discovery a pattern of another kind. Sometimes an anomaly is announced and then quietly relabeled. Sometimes a site becomes suddenly inaccessible. Sometimes an artifact becomes lost, a paper becomes withdrawn, a topic becomes unfundable. You don't have to imagine a single villain to notice that institutions prefer stability. They are built to protect their own continuity. A timeline is not just a story. It is scaffolding. Couriers hang from it. Museums arrange themselves around it. Entire fields teach from it. When a new fact threatens the scaffolding, the instinct is to minimize the threat, to file it away, to reduce it to an oddity. This isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's simply the inertia of systems too large to turn quickly. But the effect can feel the same to someone standing at the edge of accepted history, a widening silence. And silence in a way is also data. Silence tells you where the pressure points are. It tells you which questions make people uneasy. It tells you where the story is weakest, not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. If you're listening, late traveller, you might notice how the mind behaves around incompleteness. It tries to close the gap. It reaches for certainty. It wants the seventh civilization to be either absolutely true or absolutely false, but the most honest place to rest is often between those extremes. The planet's record is fragmentary. Erosion is time thinking, slowly grinding the evidence into dust. Tectonics is time rearranging the shells. Oceans are time hiding things in plain sight. And human culture itself is a kind of weather rewriting, forgetting, mythologizing, repurposing. So when we say pattern, what we really mean is this: the world leaves recurring signatures and humans keep encountering them. We find flood layers and flood stories. We find celestial alignments and persistent sky myths. We find drowned coasts and legends of swallowed lands. We find abrupt climate shifts and oral memories of sudden darkness. Each pairing is imperfect, but together they suggest that the past is not quiet. It's speaking in fragments. And once you allow that possibility, another pattern appears, one that feels personal. The sense that you listening now are not here by accident. Not because fate is magical, but because attention is rare. The universe is full of signals we ignore. Most of history is silence because we don't know how to listen for it. Yet here you are awake to the idea that the timeline might be larger, that the surface story might be only the latest layer of sediment. This is where the pattern turns from external to internal. It becomes a mirror. If earlier civilizations rose and fell, then the question is not just what happened to them. It is what it means for us to be alive now, in a time of shifting coasts and rising seas and volatile skies. It does not require fear. It requires perspective. It invites the calm recognition that complexity is precious, that continuity is fragile, and that humility might be the most advanced technology a civilization can develop. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. A warning does not always arrive as a siren. Sometimes it arrives as a thin line on a graph, a slow drift in a magnetic map, a quiet change in the chemistry of air trapped inside ancient ice. Picture a dim laboratory at midnight, traveller, where a core of polar ice lies on a metal table like a frozen timeline. Under the light, it isn't beautiful in the ordinary way. It is layered. It is patient. It is the earth writing in translucent bands, each one a season of breath, each one a year that once felt like a whole world to someone living inside it. I have always trusted these quiet records more than loud opinions, not because they are perfect, but because they do not try to persuade. They simply exist. A layer holds a little more ash than it should. Another holds less sunlight in its isotopes. Another holds a sudden jump in dust as if the wind once carried grief across continents. And when you stand close to those layers, you feel something strange. History becomes physical. It stops being a story told in a classroom and becomes a substance you could touch if you dared. This is where the idea of warning begins. Observer not as a threat, but as recognition. If the planet has changed abruptly before, then abrupt change is part of the planet's vocabulary. We like to imagine that catastrophe would be obvious, dramatic, announced in advance by the sky itself. But nature rarely performs for an audience. It shifts quietly until it doesn't. It accumulates pressure until it releases. It gathers heat until it reorganizes. The warning is not a single event. It is the slow alignment of conditions that make certain events more likely, like pieces of a lock turning toward the same position. And in the language of deep time, likely is its own kind of gravity. It pulls futures toward familiar shapes. In the stories of resets, you see the same ingredients returning water: fire, cold, darkness. Floods erase borders, ash erases harvests, ice erases roads, dust erases sunlight. You don't need to believe in a perfect repeating schedule to notice that the planet has a limited set of ways to rewrite its surface, and it uses them again and again across eras so long they feel unreal. What makes the warning feel intimate, though, is not the scale. It is the timing inside a human life. A cycle measured in tens of thousands of years still has edges that cut into decades. A coastline can drown within a few centuries, and for a community living at the shore, that is not geology. That is a family story. A volcanic winter can last long enough to break a civilization's rhythm, and for the people inside it, it is not climate variability. It is hunger migration, silence in the marketplace, prayers that sound different under a dimmed sun. So when we speak of a seventh civilization, the warning is not the label. The warning is the question that follows it. If earlier worlds rose into complexity and then collapsed, what did collapse look like from the inside? It probably didn't feel like the end of the world at first. It probably felt like supply chains failing seasons, arriving wrong, storms becoming unfamiliar rulers, losing credibility, myths returning. Because myths are what people hold when the ground beneath them turns uncertain. Collapse in most cases is not one great dramatic moment. It is a long unravelling punctuated by shocks, each shock trimming away what is fragile until only the most basic things remain. And yet the earth also teaches another lesson, listener. After a reset, life returns. Rivers carve new paths. Forests reclaim abandoned stone. Coral grows over drowned walls. The planet does not mourn. It repurposes. It is not cruel. It is indifferent in a way that can feel almost merciful, because it means nothing is personal. The warning is not aimed at you. It is simply the world behaving as it has always behaved. Still, there is something different about our moment, and it is not our technology. It is our awareness. We can see patterns in carbon trapped in ice. We can map submerged landscapes. We can measure the drift of magnetic fields. We can watch the ocean rise millimetre by millimetre and understand what that implies across decades. Earlier civilizations may have felt the turning only when it was already inside their houses, inside their crops, inside the cough of the sky. We at least can watch the turning approach from farther away. But awareness creates its own unease. The mind wants certainty, a date, a guarantee of villain, a single cause. Yet the earth is a system of many causes braided together. A warning then becomes less about predicting one event and more about learning a posture, humility, preparation, adaptability, the willingness to revise the story we tell ourselves about permanence. Perhaps the most dangerous illusion any civilization can hold is that the present rules are stable because they feel familiar. If the past is a series of lost rooms beneath the floorboards of time, then a warning is the soft creak that tells you someone is moving down there. Not a monster, not a prophecy, just motion. Just the reminder that the house of history is older than the furniture we've arranged in it, and the foundations have been rebuilt before. So tonight, traveller, let the warning be gentle. Let it be a quiet widening of perspective. Let it be the thought that safety does not come from denial, but from seeing clearly without panic, without drama. The planet has turned pages before. It will turn them again. Our task is not to fear the turning, but to understand what we are small and luminous within the larger rhythm. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. Picture the sky as a vast instrument listener, an ancient observatory that never closes. Even when we sleep, it continues its slow measurements. Stars drift. Orbits precess. Dust moves between worlds like a thought passing through a mind too large to name. And somewhere in that quiet machinery there are moments when the heavens feel less like a backdrop and more like a participant, when the sky seems to lean closer not to threaten, but to remind us that Earth has never been isolated. I think about this on nights when the city is quiet and the screens have gone dark. I sit with old star charts and newer data, the kind that arrives in clean numbers stripped of drama. A meteor stream is just a date range. A solar storm is a forecast. A comet is a curve. But if you stare at the curves long enough, you start to feel what they represent: bodies moving at impossible speeds, carrying ancient ice and rock crossing paths that were set in motion before any human language existed. This is the strange comfort of astronomy. It teaches you that the universe is lawful. It also teaches you that lawful does not mean safe. Patterns can be beautiful and still be indifferent to what they touch. In the mythology of resets, the sky is often the messenger. Skyfire, falling stars, a sun that dims, a darkness that lasts too long. Ancient people described these things in the only terms they had, and we with our instruments translate their metaphors into mechanisms. We say impact winter, we say atmospheric aerosols, we say solar variability, we say geomagnetic excursion. The words change, but the core sensation remains. The sky can change the Earth faster than the Earth can explain it. And here is what feels unsettling when you layer the stories over the science observer. The planet carries signatures of sudden change that cannot be reduced to one cause. Sometimes it is ice and water, sometimes it is fire from below, sometimes it is a bruise from above. The sky does not need to be hostile to be powerful. It only needs to be itself. A comet's orbit is a long ellipse, a slow promise. It spends most of its life far from the inner warmth, where sunlight is faint and time stretches thin. Then, for a brief window, it returns bright, visible, almost intimate. To an ancient observer, that return could feel like intention. To a modern observer, it is gravity doing what gravity does. But gravity too can feel like memory. It brings things back. When we speak of cycles on Earth, it is easy to forget that Earth's cycles are nested inside larger ones. The tilt of our axis shifts over long spans. The shape of our orbit changes slightly. The Sun itself has moods and storms. And beyond the Sun, the solar system moves through a galaxy filled with dust radiation and invisible fields. We do not need to invent cosmic conspiracies to admit this simple truth. Earth is not sealed. It is exposed like a living skin. So imagine a civilization reaching its height during a long stable era. Trade routes humming, harvests predictable, architecture turning confident, knowledge accumulating in temples, libraries, guilds. And then imagine the sky changing in a way that doesn't care about confidence. A chain of volcanic eruptions triggered by shifting stress. A meteor air burst that lights the horizon and shatters windows. A haze that lingers, thinning sunlight, cooling summers, shortening growing seasons. It would not feel like the end at first. It would feel like a bad year. Then another. Then a decade that refuses to recover. This is how the sky becomes part of the story, not as a villain, but as a clock that sometimes strikes harder than expected. And if we are speaking in the language of the apocalypse for sleep, we can let the sky be both scientific and poetic. Radiation becomes a whisper passing through our atmosphere, sometimes harmless, sometimes rearranging chemistry like a hand turning pages too quickly. Meteor trails become brief handwriting across the dark, a reminder that the space between worlds is not empty. The aurora becomes a veil beautiful, but born from particles that could also disrupt the fragile systems we now depend on. Our modern world is delicate in a way stone cities were not. We have built a civilization that breathes through wires and satellites, through timed deliveries and synchronized grids. That is not a criticism. It is simply the shape we have chosen. But it means that the sky's influence is not only physical now, it is infrastructural. A solar storm is not just a light show, it is a question asked of our networks. A drought is not just a season. It is a stress test of politics, migration and food. A rising sea is not just water. It is a slow rewrite of borders. And yet here is the quiet counterweight traveller. The sky also gives us perspective. It shows us that we are not alone in time, not alone in the universe's long story. We are a moment of awareness looking up. We are matter that learned to measure itself. That matters even if it changes nothing about the laws that govern comets and storms. It matters because it changes how we respond. Earlier civilizations may have endured the turning in confusion, in myth, in fear. We can endure it with knowledge, with preparation, with cooperation, with humility. We can look at the sky and see both beauty and risk, without turning either into panic. So the sky in our sequence is not only about impact and darkness, it is about the relationship between our fragile civilization and the larger stage it sits upon. It is the reminder that the universe is not separate from history. The universe is part of history. If 6 civilizations truly rose and fell, then the sky watched each one. Not with judgment, not with intent, just with light, with radiation, with gravity, with the slow turning of orbits. And if we are the 7th, then the same sky watches us now, silent and patient, while we argue with ourselves about what is real. Tonight, listener, let that sky feel close, not as a threat, but as a ceiling of wonder. Let it soften your thoughts rather than sharpen them. Let it be the place where fear dissolves into scale, where urgency becomes awareness, and where you can rest inside the truth that the cosmos is vast enough to hold both mystery and peace. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. Imagine this observer, a thin seam of rock split open in a quarry wall, and inside it, like a secret held for far too long, there is a line of metal that should not be there. Not a vein of ore, not a glitter of crystals, but something shaped, something that looks as if it once belonged to hands that measured, cut and assembled. The workers brush it clean. The air grows still. For a moment the world feels as if it has misfiled a page of its own history. This is the part of the journey where we return to the Earth itself, not as scenery, but as witness, because the planet does not only remember through myths, it remembers through layers, through pollen trapped in mud, through ash in ice, through shorelines stranded high above today's oceans, through scars of glaciers and the sudden absence of rivers that once flowed where deserts now sleep. The Earth keeps its archive the way a deep mind keeps memory compressed, rearranged, sometimes incomplete, but rarely accidental. And when we look closely, we find hints of rhythm. Not a perfect drum beat, not a neat calendar, but a repeating pattern of stability followed by disruption. Long stretches where climate holds steady enough for life to organize itself, forests, spreading coastlines, settling ecosystems, balancing, and then abrupt turns, rapid warming pulses, sudden freezes, years, when the sky dims, oceans rising faster than any shoreline can adapt volcanic winters that silence summer. Each time the surface is rewritten, each time anything fragile is erased first, wood, cloth, paper, food stores, cities built for comfort rather than endurance. If earlier civilizations existed, their weakest traces would vanish almost completely. What would remain would be strange and stubborn stone too heavy to move foundations, buried under new sediment fragments, sealed in places where time does not circulate easily, and the greatest hiding place of all would be the ocean. During the last ice age, sea level was far lower than it is today. Vast continental shelves were dry land valleys, plains, rivers and coastlines, where people would naturally gather. When ice melted, the ocean rose and drowned those landscapes, not gently, not always slowly, but in surges that could swallow a coastline within a human lifetime. The Earth did not only flood land, it archived it. So when sonar reveals terraces, linear edges, and step-like structures underwater, it pulls at a question that refuses to go away. Nature can make astonishing geometry. Erosion can carve, fractures can mimic order. But sometimes the angles feel too deliberate, the patterns too repeatable, the placement too convenient, exactly where an ancient shoreline once would have been. And that is where the Earth becomes more than rock. It becomes a threshold. Because the deeper you look into these layers, the more the official timeline begins to feel like a bright lamp over a small table, while the rest of the room remains dark. Modern archaeology has done extraordinary work within the span it can clearly see. But deep time is immense, and catastrophe is a ruthless editor. Whole chapters could exist and leave only footnotes. In my mind, the most haunting possibility is not that we have been lied to in a dramatic sense, but that the record is genuinely incomplete, broken by forces that do not care about continuity. The Earth is older than any institution. It does not preserve narratives. It preserves evidence, and evidence is often fragmentary. So we stand here, traveller between certainty and imagination. On one side, rigorous methods, careful dating, skeptical discipline. On the other, anomalies that refuse to settle, stories that echo across continents, and ruins that appear where they should not. And in the middle is the honest posture of the scientist-poet to admit what we know, to name what we do not, and to keep watching without demanding immediate closure. Because some mysteries are not doors you force open. They are landscapes you learn slowly, step by step, with patience. If the Earth has hosted cycles of collapse and renewal, then it is not only a graveyard, it is also a teacher. It teaches humility. It teaches that progress is fragile. It teaches that the ground beneath us is not a stage built for us. It is a living archive shaped by firewater ice and time thinking in slow motion. And if we are the seventh civilization, perhaps the most important evidence is not a single artifact or a single drowned platform. Perhaps it is the pattern itself, the way stability can end, the way memory can scatter, the way survivors rebuild and call it the beginning. In the end, listener, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. Imagine this traveller a night where the instruments do not blink with comfort, but with urgency. The magnetometer needle drifts a little farther than expected. The ocean charts update, and the coastline lines look thinner, as if the sea is patiently rewriting its own border. Somewhere far above the atmosphere, particles arrive from a sun that never truly sleeps, and the sky accepts them like silent mail. This is the moment in our story where the past stops feeling distant, because the most unsettling part of the seventh civilization idea is not what may have happened long ago. It is the possibility that the same forces still exist, not as myths, not as punishments, just as physics steady, indifferent, returning on its own schedule. The Earth moves through cycles the way a heart moves through beats. Tilt, wobble, orbit, long stretches of balance, then sudden shifts. Ice expands and retreats, currents rearrange, volcanoes breathe, the magnetic field wanders. And above it all, the solar system is never empty. Comets and debris cross our path like forgotten travellers, passing close enough to change the sky, sometimes close enough to change everything. If earlier worlds ended through combinations water, fire, cold, darkness, then the warning is not that catastrophe is guaranteed. The warning is that the ingredients are always nearby. A warming ocean that rises by inches becomes over time a force that swallows harbours and cities. A volcanic winter, rare but possible, can dim a sunlit planet into years of hungry uncertainty. A sudden disruption in climate patterns can reorganize ecosystems faster than our fragile systems can adapt. These are not cinematic apocalypses. They are the slow, heavy mechanics of a planet that has never promised permanence, and when people speak of the return, it is easy to imagine a dramatic switch a single day when everything changes. But the planet doesn't move like that. It offers signs, subtle at first, then unmistakable for those who have learned to read them. The signals do not shout. They whisper, in a chart, in a trend, in a measurement that refuses to stay inside the expected range. I used to think of the past as something behind us, sealed like a museum room. But the longer you sit with data late nights, cold coffee dust on old maps, the more you feel that time is not a hallway. It is a shoreline. And shorelines move. They advance and retreat, sometimes gently, sometimes in surges, and the land that seemed safe yesterday becomes the seafloor tomorrow. So the question changes quietly, the way an eclipse changes daylight without a sound. It becomes less. Did 6 civilizations exist before ours and more? If the Earth has erased civilizations before, what does it take to protect memory now? Because a civilization is not only buildings, it is continuity. It is language passed intact. It is knowledge that survives the loss of power grids and shipping routes and comfortable climates. It is the ability to remember who you are when the world stops cooperating. And maybe that is why the idea of cycles feels so heavy. It doesn't only threaten structures, it threatens confidence. It suggests that our modern certainty is a thin layer over deep uncertainty, and that the ground we stand on has watched certainty collapse before. But there is another way to hold this traveller, one that doesn't lead to fear. Awareness can be gentler than denial. To recognise cycles is not to surrender. It is to understand the environment that shapes us. The seventh civilization, if it is real in any sense, might be the first to study the pattern with open eyes. The first to treat history not as a proud staircase, but as a fragile candle that must be sheltered from wind. Because even if the evidence is incomplete, even if the anomalies never resolve into a single neat conclusion, the lesson remains. We live on a world that changes. We live under a sky that moves. And we are made of the same delicate materials, breath memory community that have always been vulnerable to sudden silence. So tonight let the idea of return be simple, not a doom but a reminder. The past is not only behind you, it is beneath you, around you, inside the patterns of water and stone and starlight. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Sleep, traveller, the cosmos will keep watch. On some nights, traveller, I spread old maps across the desk the way others spread blankets carefully, quietly, with a respect that feels almost ceremonial. The paper smells faintly of dust and ink. Coastlines are drawn with confident lines as if the world agreed to stay put. But the longer you look, the more you notice the ghosts beneath the ink, submerged shelves, forgotten riverbeds, continental edges that once sat higher in the light. And then you realise the maps were never promises. They were snapshots taken during a brief pause in a much older motion. This is the point in our journey where we stop chasing certainty and begin practicing something rarer, humility. Because humility is not surrender. It is an instrument, a way of seeing clearly in a universe that does not tailor itself to our comfort. If we are the seventh civilization, then we are also the seventh attempt to make meaning inside a world that changes. And meaning, like architecture, can be built too quickly, too confidently on foundations we have not inspected. We tell ourselves the past is simple, because simplicity helps us sleep. But the Earth does not respect our need for a clean timeline. It keeps its record in layers broken and folded, and sometimes the record is less like a book and more like a shoreline rewritten by every storm. The scientist in me wants numbers, dates, mechanisms. The poet in me watches those desires soften at the edges, because I have learned what every careful observer eventually learns. Some questions are made to widen, not to close. You reach for the answer, and you find another horizon. So let this part be a reflection, not a verdict. Consider what it means for memory to survive at all. A city can fall and still be remembered. A language can fracture and still echo in names, in prayers and songs. But a total reset, true erasure does not only break buildings, it breaks continuity. It scatters people until they no longer share a story. It turns knowledge into superstition mathematics, into myth astronomy, into ritual. It converts the precise into the symbolic, because symbols are lighter to carry when you're starving, migrating, surviving. If there were earlier worlds, perhaps their greatest remnants were not the stones that lasted, but the instincts that did. The urge to look up, the urge to align, the feeling that the sky is not a ceiling but a clock, that the stars are not decoration but information. Even now when I step outside in the deep hours, the city quiet around me, I feel that old, pull the same pull that must have guided countless people, long before recorded history people who had nothing but darkness and the discipline to watch it. There is a tenderness in that, kind of continuity that catastrophe cannot fully sever. And maybe that is why myths repeat. Not because ancient people were naive, but because human beings are excellent at preserving emotional truth when factual details are stripped away. Trauma travels. It moves from mouth to mouth across generations, becoming story, becoming warning, becoming ritual. Flood? Fire? Long winter? A sun that seems to dim? Ash that falls like grey snow? A sea that climbs inland as if it has decided to take back what it once gave? Whether any one myth is literal is less important than the chorus they form together. A chorus suggests pattern, and pattern suggests the earth has rhythms that outlast kingdoms. Still, traveller, we must be careful. Wonder can turn sharp if we force it to become proof. The most honest stance, the one that keeps both science and sleep intact, is to hold possibility without clutching it, to explore without demanding that the universe sign a confession. So let us reflect in a way that feels grounded. Look at what we do know. We know the planet has swung through dramatic climate shifts. We know sea levels have risen and fallen by vast amounts across glacial cycles. We know volcanism has reshaped skies. We know impacts have happened in Earth's long history, and that the cosmos still carries debris on looping paths. We know human populations have faced bottlenecks, and that survival sometimes comes down to small scattered groups. None of this proves a 6 worlds before us narrative, but it does build a context where forgetting is plausible, and where the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Because absence can be manufactured by time itself. Erosion is time thinking. Water is time moving. Ice is time pressing. Sediment is time hiding. The longer the clock runs, the more it edits. It doesn't care what it removes. It doesn't care what it preserves. It only follows gravity, chemistry, temperature, pressure. And that indifference is what makes the idea of lost epochs feel so eerie. Not because someone is always hiding the truth, but because the planet is capable of hiding it without intent. And yet, sometimes the Earth slips. It reveals a corner of something buried, a geometry that feels too deliberate, a stone that sits where stone shouldn't, a pattern that refuses to be random. These are the moments that keep me up on long nights, traveller, not with fear, with a steady, quiet attention. The feeling that I'm standing in a library where most books have been burned and still a few charred pages remain fluttering at the edges of the present. If the 7th civilization is real as metaphor, then its message is simple. We are not guaranteed continuity. We must treat memory as precious infrastructure. Not only data, not only archives, but wisdom ways of living that can endure when systems fail. Ways of cooperating when resources tighten. Ways of seeing ourselves as part of Earth's cycles, not rulers above them. And if the 7th civilization is real as history, then the message is heavier, but also strangely empowering. Because it would mean we are not blind. We are learning to read the pattern. We are learning to measure the whispers. We are becoming perhaps the first civilization that can look at the ruins and admit softly that progress is not a ladder. It is a wave. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again, and you are not lost in space. You are part of it. Let your thoughts loosen their grip. Let the questions remain unanswered without becoming unbearable. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch. A slow rain begins outside, listener, the kind that doesn't fall in drops so much as it gathers and releases as if the sky's exhaling. The window turns into a dim mirror. Beyond it, streetlights soften into halos, and the world looks slightly older than it did an hour ago, like everything is being gently archived by water and shadow. This is where we begin the descent. Not the dramatic kind of descent people imagine when they hear the word. Not falling, not fear. Just the quiet lowering of the mind's brightness, the way a lighthouse turns its beam away and lets the sea return to darkness. Because you can't stay awake forever inside a question. At some point the body asks for rest, and the universe, patient as it is, allows you to set the weight down. If we are the 7th civilization, then tonight is not only a story about the past, it is also a meditation on how fragile now really is. Civilizations do not vanish only through impact and flood. Sometimes they vanish through distraction, through exhaustion, through the slow erosion of shared meaning, the collapse of trust, the quiet failure of systems that once felt immortal. And still, even in that thought, there is comfort. Because what endures is not always what we build. What endures is what we notice. In my own small routines, I've learned to trust the simple things, the steady hum of a fan at night, the familiar weight of a blanket, the way a cup of tea cools predictably beside a notebook. These are tiny laws, reliable as gravity. They remind me that the universe is not chaos. It is pattern, even when the pattern is too large to see at once. So, traveller, let's hold the idea of cycles the way you hold a warm stone firm, enough to feel it gentle enough not to bruise your hand. The earth turns, it tilts, it wobbles, it rearranges coastlines with the patience of a sculptor, and the sky far above keeps its own schedules, meteor streams like recurring letters, comets on slow return routes, a sun that breathes in storms of magnetism. None of this is personal, none of it is punishment. It is simply the physics of a living planet moving through a living cosmos. That is the strange relief of scientific thinking when it's paired with wonder. The relief is not in control. It's in understanding that we were never supposed to control everything. We were supposed to observe, adapt, and keep each other warm through the dark. And maybe that's the deeper reason the old stories persist. Not because they are literal documentaries, but because they are survival tools. They remind a new generation that stability is a season, not a guarantee. They remind us that preparation can be quiet, that awareness can be gentle, that humility can be a kind of technology. When I imagine the survivors of earlier collapses, whether real in history or real as metaphor, I don't picture heroes. I picture ordinary people. People who kept walking, people who shared food, people who taught children where the waterline used to be. People who looked up at the same stars and told the same simple truths: stay together, remember what you can, and listen for the changes. That kind of survival does not require prophecy. It requires attention. So if the 8th civilization is ever born, if another chapter rises from the ruins of this one, let it not begin with panic. Let it begin with memory preserved intentionally, with libraries built to endure, with knowledge taught in ways that do not depend on fragile networks, with compassion treated as infrastructure, with the humility to say we live on a planet that can change, and we will build as if change is real. But tonight you don't have to solve any of that. Tonight, your only job is to drift. Let the questions become softer around the edges. Let the images fade like distant coastlines. Let the ancient ruins sink back under imagined oceans, and let the stars return to being what they always were, quiet lights scattered like punctuation across a sentence too long for one lifetime. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight the universe whispers again. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts settle. Let sleep come the way the tide comes, inevitable, gentle and patient. Imagine the horizon, traveller, faint silver infinite. The world below it has gone still. The wind no longer carries questions, it carries memory. The stars above are no longer distances, they are archives glowing with the quiet evidence of everything that has ever burned. This is where the story softens, where all cycles end and begin again, where history exhales. We have walked through forgotten epochs, followed trails through stone and sea, traced the heartbeat of civilizations erased by time and tide. Each fragment, each myth, each anomalous artifact was a whisper pointing toward the same truth that the earth is a living rhythm, not a static page. Civilizations are not singular miracles, they are seasonal blooms in the soil of the cosmos. They rise, they shine, they fall, and sometimes, if the conditions are kind, they return. But the 7th civilization, ours, is the first to watch itself in real time, to know that change is not myth, but mathematics. We can measure the ice retreating. We can chart the wobble of the magnetic field. We can watch the carbon rise and the oceans climb, see cities glow from orbit and fade during blackouts. We can map the temperature of our own age the way geologists once mapped eras. Knowledge itself has become a mirror showing us both wonder and warning. Still, awareness is not doom, it is awakening. The very act of noticing is resistance to the amnesia that has haunted the species. For thousands of years, humans have rebuilt from silence, unaware of what came before. But now, traveller, we can remember forward. We can choose to break the rhythm, to turn knowledge into survival humility, into technology, memory into design. The next civilization, the 8th, does not need to be born from ashes. It can be born from understanding. The question is not whether collapse will come, it is whether continuity can endure within collapse. Because endings are not absolute. Forests regrow after fire, rivers carve new paths after floods, even the stars recycle themselves, scattering heavy elements that later become the bones of planets. The universe does not waste, it transforms, and so can we. Imagine a world that learns from its own fragility, a world that accepts impermanence as its foundation, rather than its failure. Imagine cities designed like coral reefs, flexible and patient. Energy drawn not from conquest but from resonance. Memory preserved not on fragile servers but in living systems, encoded in the DNA of forests and the stories of children. Imagine a species that stops fearing its place in the cycle and begins to guide it gently like a tide redirected by thought. Perhaps that is the final revelation hidden inside all the myths, that destruction is not punishment, it is punctuation. It ends one sentence so another can begin. The survivors of the past were not cursed, they were chosen by circumstance to carry the language of existence a little farther down the line, and now that role is ours. We stand not at the top of history, but within its breathing heart between the echo and the return. There will come a night far in the future when someone else will look at our ruins and wonder who we were. They will find our geometry, our circuits, our light. They will hear fragments of our language in the wind and the water, and maybe if we do this well, they will not say they vanished. They will say they prepared the way. So listener, as the rain fades and the hum of the earth returns beneath the quiet sky, let this final thought settle like dust on ancient stone. You are not small because you are temporary. You are luminous because you are part of the pattern. Every breath is a continuation of 1 billion forgotten stories. Every dream tonight is archaeology in motion. Let the weight of that be light. Let it guide you toward rest. The world will turn. The stars will remain. The universe will keep its promise of rhythm. Sleep now, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch. The cycles are old, but awareness is young, and tonight it has found you. Close your eyes. The story does not end, it simply changes form. And somewhere beyond our sight, the next civilization is already learning to dream. We've reached the edge of tonight's story, traveller. Not an ending, just the moment the lantern light pulls back, leaving the ruins to breathe in their own darkness again. We drifted through broken timelines and stubborn anomalies, through drowned coastlines and stones that refused to behave, and for a little while we listened as the earth spoke in fragments. If we truly are the 7th civilization, then the past is not behind us. It is beneath us. It is inside us. And somewhere in the silence between what we can prove and what we can only sense, something older than our names continues to turn. The universe does not hurry. It lets continents rise and sink. It lets ice remember. It lets dust keep its chronology. And it lets us be small without being meaningless. Brief lights moving across an ancient surface trying to read the pattern before it fades again. Maybe that is all science has ever been, observer. Not certainty, but attention. A willingness to sit with the unanswered, to let entropy and memory share the same room, to feel gravity, not only as force, but as a kind of longing that pulls everything back into connection. So rest now. Let the questions soften. Let the timeline blur into dream. Stay curious, listener. Rest well, traveller. The universe will keep watch.